welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I am Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest author is His Excellency Bishop Donald J. Hying of the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. He is an author of the book Love Never Fails, Living the Catholic Faith in Our Daily Lives, published by our good friends at Ignatius Press, available naturally through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Welcome, Bishop. Great to see you and to meet you.
Thanks so much, Doug. It's an honor to be on your show and just to talk with you about the faith today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, people recently saw you on with Johnette as well. And they've also probably recognized you from other things you've done that we've aired on EWTN, including a series having to do with the Catechism. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so back about 6 years ago, we did a series on just the chapters of the adult catechism of the Catholic Church called Echo. Mm-hmm. So the word catechesis comes from the word echo in the Greek. So it's really, it's an artistic video presentation. And the goal of it was really just to interest people in reading the catechism. Mm-hmm. You know, just kind of a teaser, a lure to get them through a little bit of theology and a lot of music to pick up the catechism and read it.
Right, and they proved popular. We like to run them after some of our longer masses, and that kind of has that same feel coming out of a nice event like a mass. Now let's talk about this book. Is this the first book you've written, or where does this fall in?
It is. Yeah, I've never had a published book before, so it's kind of a neat thing.
What was the genesis behind trying to write something like this? Was this your idea, somebody else's idea, or?
It really is. A lot of it is based on some of my columns in the local Catholic newspaper and things that I've developed through the years. And then we just kind of worked that into a flow, into a narrative. And a good friend of mine sent it to Ignatius Press on my behalf. He didn't really tell me he was doing it. And then lo and behold, I got a letter saying your manuscript's been accepted. So, yeah.
Now the title, is there a tie-in to your Episcopal motto there?
Yeah, that is my Episcopal motto in Latin. In Latin, it's caritas numquam excidit, but yeah, love never fails. And as soon as somebody asked me, what's your Episcopal motto, shortly after I was named a bishop, that immediately came to me. I never even thought about it. It was just kind of, yeah, that's it.
Is that because you love the idea that your life is a romantic adventure?
There you go. Take it from the introduction of the book. It is a romantic adventure. When you fall in love with God, life becomes this tremendously exciting adventure.
Kind of a different definition of romance novels or romance stories in your mind, though, right?
Yeah. Well, the ultimate romance, right? God's love for us out in Christ. I mean, the whole Bible is really a love story.
Now, you talk about we live in an exciting moment in history that the Church throughout the world feels the energy and urgency of the new evangelization. What is the new evangelization? How would you define it?
I think John Paul did well in articulating it. It's the idea that traditional cultures that were Catholic, that relied on this thriving Catholic subculture to form young people in the faith, in many places that's evaporated, that's collapsed, it's disappeared. And the fact that we find ourselves once again kind of in the upper room on Pentecost, needing to go out into the world and speak about Christ as if people have never heard of him before, because in fact, they really haven't. So here in the States, I think that's very true. And we can't rely anymore on this Catholic subculture of all these institutions to form our people.
Now, at the beginning of the book here, in the self-surrender to the transforming love of God, you said, is it harder to love God or be loved by God? What's your answer?
I think harder to be loved by God, because it demands us allowing him to love us, to surrender to his love for us. And we know ourselves in a way that no one else does. And often, you know, in my pastoral ministry, I certainly found that most, if not all, people really struggle with the conviction that God loves us unconditionally because of that.
You say to live with oneself throughout their whole life is at times a tremendous burden. Is that what you found in your own life?
At times, right? I remember times wondering as a kid, like, what would it be like to be somebody else? I always liked reading biographies and history, maybe to enter into the vicarious experience of others. But I think the poverty is that I can't be anybody other than who I am. But when I embrace that and realize that God created me as his beloved son, what I may view as poverty is actually the wealth of God's love for me. You know,
Right.
that God willed each one of us to be, he created us to be. And just the wonder of that being is a tremendous grace that we are rather than we're not. And
And he
that's,
and he finds us all irresistible. I thought that was an interesting way of putting it.
I think so, right?
Right.
I mean, we're created to fall in love with God and to learn to do here on earth what we hope to do perfectly in heaven, and that is to love God with our mind, heart, and soul.
You talk about a passionate pursuit. I thought when we surrender to this divine initiative, we discover our lives to be a sacred romance, a passionate love relationship that spills out into everyone and everything we encounter. Why is it so difficult for people today to accept that or see that?
I think the temptation of our culture is to compartmentalize life. So if religion is given any space at all, it's a very tiny space. Whereas obviously the scope of our Catholic faith is universal, so that it involves everything. It includes everything. It includes culture and arts and education and healthcare and marriage and family. And I think our culture has a hard time saying that there's this universal breadth of truth that grasps everything.
Now, you talk about also in your own life, you talk celibacy is more than a simple renunciation of marriage and family or even an exclusive friendships. It is the opposite of shutting love out of life. How so?
I think celibacy, the goal of celibacy is that we have an open heart, a heart that's emptied out for God and for other people, so that the call for me as a celibate is that there's room in my heart for all of God's people and that I can strive to love them unconditionally and serve them.
Right, and as we kind of alluded to, as you roll into the Kairos moments, perhaps the greatest obstacles to our spiritual growth, you say today, is the intense and relentless busyness that pervades our days. How do we fight against that?
I think really, and I'm speaking to myself here as much as to anybody else, the discipline of daily prayer. You know, that I need to find a place and a time every day to give my life to prayer, to God. Otherwise, it's just going to be, I'm going to be on the treadmill of the culture and life and busyness and distraction all the time.
Well, you talk about, you also reference chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke, where Mary is simply sitting at the feet of Jesus, attentively listening, while Martha is running around the kitchen. Jesus does not rebuke Martha for working hard at necessary tasks, which a lot of people misunderstand, but calls her to see the deeper purpose of the dinner party. What is the deeper purpose?
To be in that particular context, to sit with Jesus, to be in communion with him, and simply to enjoy his presence as the guest. So I think I say in there, what's the point of having a perfect table and tasty food if I'm so distracted that I miss out on the wonder of the guest that's here in our midst?
What do you mean by the vulnerable real presence and the vulnerability of God?
I think if we ponder the incarnation, we see God makes himself vulnerable in the person of Jesus, that God becomes a human being subject to everything that we are limited by, except for sin, of course, but including death. So God makes himself vulnerable in our human condition, even unto death, and is willing to love us to that extreme. So there's a vulnerability to love. I can't love from the sidelines. I can't love without fear of being hurt or wounded. And when we see the bloodied body of Jesus on the cross, it's like here's the vulnerability of love taken to its absolute extreme, for our salvation.
Now, you also say the Eucharist calls us to availability, to let ourselves be inconvenienced and our schedules rearranged, to not always insist on our way of doing things, to be sensitive to the needs and feelings of others, to respond sometimes before we even are asked and compelled to do so. How does the Eucharist do that?
I think because in the Eucharist we see the availability of Jesus. Yeah, I think we can never forget that on the last night of his earthly life, at the Last Supper, Jesus was thinking of us. He wasn't thinking of himself. He was thinking of us and how he could be available, present to us in a saving way until the end of time. And his response to that question is the Eucharist. And so St. John Vianney says that Eucharist is the greatest gift that God has given us, because if there was a greater gift, the Lord would have given us that. So in the Eucharist, if I go to Mass and receive communion, if I do Eucharistic adoration, if I pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament, God makes himself available to me in this sacramental form. And I've never gotten over the wonder of that, that love makes itself available.
Now, in the chapter, the section, everything is a gift from the Father, you say, I thank God for the big things. I also thank God for the little things. And then you go on to say, gratitude saves us from self-pity, resentment, jealousy, anger, selfishness, and entitlement. Thankfulness sets us free to be generous, joyful, kind, sacrificial, because we know that everything we have is a gift meant to be shared and passed on to others. Is there a lack of gratefulness and gratitude in our culture?
I think so. I mean, there's certainly, millions of grateful people out there, but I think there's a sense of entitlement in our culture, that somehow I deserve everything that I get. And I've always felt that I don't deserve anything, but when I realize that, then everything is a gift. And entitlement robs us of the joy of gratitude. Whereas if I truly am aware that life is a gift, life itself is a gift, then my response is this posture of gratitude to God, which frees me to share my gifts, my life with others.
Right. In the section, Christ waits for us, how often did you throw the ball around and break things in your parents' living room?
Not too often. Often enough to be memorable. How's that? Right.
What lesson did you learn from that?
To always obey the rules, right? That our parents had good rules, and that if we obey them, we're going to be okay.
Right. You say here, when I disobey God, refuse to listen to him, and move away from our relationship, life shatters into pieces. Great image, like my mother's vase. Right.
Yeah, right. And it goes back to Genesis, right? So, I mean, all of that original innocence and goodness of God is shattered in the original sin. And yet the Lord comes and puts the pieces back together in Christ, even more beautifully than they were before.
Right. In the section, God is drawn to our weakness, you make the point that societies that do not tolerate human weakness and imperfection often end up eliminating those who do not measure up to some mythical standard of sufficiency. And of course, we mentioned the Third Reich, but there's a lot of aspects in our own culture today, let alone in other cultures, with who's being aborted and things like that, that are the same situation, really.
I'm struck. I think this is an accurate statistic. Upwards of 90% of unborn children diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted globally. So right there, it's like this child is not perfect, therefore they must be eliminated. And how is that different than what was done in Germany during World War II? The sense of life is somehow has to be perfect in order to be embraced and lived.
What's a spiritual spendthrift?
Someone who realizes that God has given everything to us, and therefore the only appropriate response to God's largesse is to be a spendthrift ourselves.
Okay.
I would say. Right.
You also make the point in this when you say maybe God lets us feel it sometimes a terrifying abyss of life without him so that we have some experience against which to measure the value of salvation.
Yeah, I think sometimes God lets us see, what would my life be without God? What would my life be without hope? What would my life be without Christ? And those glimpses can be terrifying, but they can also help us realize, the enormity of the gift given. So if I have nothing to contrast that with, I end up perhaps just taking it for granted, not living it.
Right.
Yeah.
You say, often I hear complaints from people that Mass is boring or that they don't get anything out of it. My consistent response is that the Eucharist is not about us. Has it been made to seem like it's too much about us?
It can be. I mean, I think in some ways perhaps we've gotten into this entertainment mode, that homily always has to be interesting, the music always has to be uplifting. And I'm not saying that justifies bad homilies or bad music,
right.
but there's a givenness to the Eucharist that transcends our experience and the details of it. If we realize, what is the Eucharist? It's the offering of Christ to the Father in which we are included. So it's really about us participating in that sacrifice and offering the sacrifice of our own life to the Father.
You had a section called Only God Could Have Created the Catholic Faith. What did you mean?
It strikes me that Catholic Church, the Catholic faith is so stunningly beautiful, true, and good that only God could have made it up. I always liken Catholicism to like a 5,000 room palace. Think of a Habsburg palace in Vienna. And in my lifetime, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get into 24 of those rooms because it's so rich, it's so beautiful, it's so deep. And just our theological tradition, our mystical tradition, our moral tradition, there's so much depth and substance to it. And sadly, many of our people know nothing of it. And that's why catechesis is so essential.
We talk about love and marriage and things and the cross of marriage even. You say that marriage is a little bit like crucifixion. Well, if that's the case, do we wonder why so many people don't want to get married these days?
I always liken the cross of Jesus to, I say that it's his marriage bed. And whenever I preach a homily at a wedding, I talk about that. That it was on the cross that Jesus laid himself down, body, soul, mind, and heart, and gave himself to his bride, the church. So the cross is his marriage bed, which means marriage is a little bit like crucifixion in the sense of this, that when two people marry each other in Christ, something must die so that something greater can live. And what dies is this independent, autonomous self. What rises out of that are these two lives intertwined around Christ, which are now going to be fruitful and beautiful, as a holy sacrament.
In the section, The Gospel Life, I recently saw the following quote on Facebook. You say, the source of all of our societal or social problems today is the idea that some people's lives are less valuable than others. I could not agree more. Is that more of a problem today than it's been?
It seems to be, that we assess people today increasingly in categories. And, at the end of the day, none of us are a category. I don't want to be a category. I'm a beloved individual, a child of God. So I think categorizing people dehumanizes them. But if we start with the fundamental human dignity of every person made in the image and likeness of God, the incidentals of our lives, and even things such as gender, race, ethnicity, all of that, those things are created by God as holy points of difference. But all of those points of difference only accentuate the fact that what unites us is our common humanity as children of God. Right. So, yeah, every person is of equal value and dignity.
And coming out of the pandemic and the issue and the high suicide rates, you have a story yourself in here. You talk about, I recently celebrated funerals of 2 suicide victims, both young people in their 20s with everything to live for. Suicide rates are increasing among certain sectors of our community. How can we be more supportive of those who struggle with depression, mental illness, or grave crises in their lives, and especially young women, are being impacted by this?
Yeah, we have a tremendous crisis of suicide, which really comes down to, in many cases, a profound lack of meaning, lack of hope, lack of connection. And I can never venture to be inside someone's heart and mind when they make that horrible decision to end their life. But I can't help but think that, connection to God, connection to others. Obviously there's people that suffer terrible mental illness, depression, and distress. But the more we can love each other, the more we can be rooted in the life of God that can only be healing, that can only be good for us.
Why is October your favorite month?
Yeah, I'd say because I love autumn. I love autumn in the Midwest. And it's kind of this sweet time of the point when nature puts on its most beautiful dress, right before it surrenders to the death of winter. But I see there just this kind of sweet melancholy that teaches us how to surrender gracefully to the seasons of our life. And I think in that chapter I talk about the cross of Christ, missing my parents, but also about wanting to go back to Egypt. So if you go back to Exodus narrative, there's a group of the Jewish people that are tired of living in the desert, tired of this food. Let's just go back to Egypt. Let's go back to slavery. And I think when we want to go back to Egypt, we need to think of the cross and how the cross is our bridge to the promised land. And it means letting go of everything, really, in order to accept it.
Now, you talk about the mysticism of gratitude. Let your life be more about praising than complaining, more about what has been given than what is lacking. How is that mystical? What does gratitude have to do with mysticism?
I think gratitude, for me, I can only speak for me. Gratitude leads me directly to the heart of God. Because when I realize the enormity of God's presence, his love, his offer of salvation to me, I find it overwhelming. And the only response I can make that makes any sense is one of gratitude for the gift that's been given. And I think gratitude then becomes a point of connection for me with God, which is what mysticism is. It's our light in God.
Now, the whole second section of the book is all about God's love is revealed through service. And one of the questions that I really want to know is, what did you do with that chicken?
Yeah, so we took the chicken home. I put it in our little garage. Our cook who had no sentimentality about animals, promptly ended its life the next
Oh,
day and
really?
cooked for us. But then I took a bunch of food up to that family, the following few days. But yeah, the chicken ended its life in our kitchen
Okay.
the next day.
Okay.
Right.
The mystery has been solved. The stewardship, give it away. And chapter, you say the human tendency is to accumulate possessions, stuff, money, Facebook friends as a cushion against insecurity, want, and fear. But we can never have enough of what we don't need, so we instinctively keep wanting more and more because it somehow will make us feel safer, more protected, and secure. And you see that especially in today's world, don't you?
I think just a tremendous need to accumulate, right? And I see that in myself, and just how free we are when we can just kind of purge and get rid of things, not cling to things. Yeah, so a lot of the spiritual life, I think, is subtraction, not necessarily addition. It's getting rid of what we don't need so that there's more room for God in my life.
Right. You make the point that when we examine the lives of the saints, they clearly understood the parable of the pearl of great price in chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel. You say we can more readily trade material things for spiritual purposes because we realize that we are getting the better end of the bargain. Now, we know that, but we don't seem to live as if we believe it.
Yeah, it's hard for all of us because sometimes heaven seems so ethereal. I mean, life after death. I mean, we believe that after we die, our soul is going to go to this place called heaven, that's our goal. And I think, on our human level, we cling to what we know. And so I think so much of what faith is difficult for us to grasp, and it means surrendering to a lot of things we don't understand.
Right.
And yet, to believe is to understand on a deeper level than just the intellect.
Now, part 3 is all about God's love found in the liturgical year of the church. Why did you want to put that in?
So I think in the liturgical life of the church, we see manifested in time and space the whole Christ event. So if you think of the liturgical year, we start with Advent and Christmas, the incarnation. We move into Lent and Easter, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, Ascension, Pentecost, ordinary time. All of that is taking us time and time again kind of on this spiral staircase, closer and closer to the mystery of God through the mystery of Christ. So the liturgy is really that manifestation through time and space, allowing us to enter in to that great.
So when you sat down to decide to put this into book form, how long did it take you to make that happen?
Some people helped me, so it took maybe, 3 or 4 months, something like that. A little bit here, a little bit there. It wasn't on a timeline, so it was just kind of when it's done, it's done. Right?
Do you enjoy writing?
I love writing. Yeah, it's always on a timeline, though, right? I've got a column due, I've got this to do, but when I can actually sit down and do it, I love to write, and I think it's because I love to read.
Do you write on a computer, and what time of the day do you try to write?
Yeah, I write on my just my laptop, and usually early in the morning, because I just find my mind is clearest in the morning, and it just kind of flows. And sometimes it doesn't, but most of the time I pray to the Lord and ask Him to speak through what I'm about to write, that it may be Him of His word. Right.
What would be something you haven't written yet that you think you need to write that people need to know?
Well, that's a great question. I'm always afraid to write because I always think it's going to be a duplication of something already said. So I'm always thinking it has to be super original. And I guess maybe there's nothing original under the sun. But yeah, I think I would need to contemplate that for a while. That'd be a great great question. I can't give you an answer, Doug. I'm sorry.
You can answer it in your next book. Very good. We're out of time. Thank you.
Oh, there you go.
Your Excellency, Bishop Donald J. Hying, Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. Love never fails. Living the Catholic faith in our daily lives. We can certainly use it. Available from the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, all things Catholic. I'm Doug Keck. Thank you for joining us right here on EWTN's Bookmark. We hope to see you next time.